Robinson? Oh my, no. This is probably one of the first what we think of as economists, although it wasn't an actually school or academic structured or type of subject at the time. But we generally think of what is economics. We associate it with one of the fathers of economic thought. Back then, it could probably be called more of a philosophy at the time. His name was Adam Smith, no relation. And he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, where he talked about some of the economic theories that I'll mention here today. And so we'll start off with what is economics, and it's about choices. The fact that we have to make choices or decisions. We have to pick something, an alternative, in a world with finite resources. So there's limited resources available. And so whenever we have to do that, we have to give up things. And that's what economics is. It's the study of the choices we make and the resources that we utilize, and then the alternatives that we give up in the process. And so economics just isn't about, what is the price of this item that I'm buying in the grocery store. It's more than just that. It's more than just money and what we do with our money. It's not just about investing and purchasing products. It does involve that, but it also involves more than that, because we make choices throughout our day, even in our individual lives. And so when economists talk about these choices and things we give up, when they refer to cost, they're actually talking about opportunity cost. So not just the money you're paying for something, but all the opportunities that you could have had that you gave up whenever you made a decision. And so, for instance, if you get up early to study for, let's say yesterday you got up early and said, I'm going to study for that midterm. There's a lot of research to show that studying the last minute doesn't work, but I'll give it a shot anyway. And so you woke up early. All the things that you gave up are the opportunity cost. The extra sleep that you could have had, the jog that you could have went for in the morning, the big breakfast that you could have eaten. All of those are the opportunity cost. And in getting people to think about that, they, of course, are asking us to think rationally. And that's what economics also does, especially when it takes opportunity cost into consideration. It asks us to rationally think about our decision-making process. Because a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people just look at how much is it going to cost me financially. They don't look at the time that they're going to be giving up. They don't look at the other things that they could be doing with their lives, or even just their day. Economists, in order to make this as rational as possible and in order to provide the best explanation there is, come up with economic models. Economic models like the Production Possibilities Frontier, or PPF as it's called. And the Production Possibilities Frontier, and you could actually do this with an individual person, or you can do it with a country, and you can graph at least two different choices, usually it is two choices, that a country or person or business could make, and show how productive they could be with devoting their resources toward either of those options or a little bit of both. And whenever you have a Production Possibilities Frontier, it is curved. It is a curved graph, and let me show you. So Production Possibilities Frontier has a curve to it, and you plot on the vertical and horizontal axis the two different variables that you're taking into consideration. So let's say it's a state, a country, a farm. What could you do with your land? You could either produce cotton or you could produce wine. And if you devoted all your resources toward cotton, you could produce this much. So you, on the horizontal axis, you would reach your furthest maximum point. That's as much as you could do. You only have enough land and other resources to produce this much cotton. Or you could put all of your resources into producing wine. So you could produce this much wine, but in that case, if you devoted everything toward wine, you couldn't produce any cotton at all. You'd have to get it from somewhere else. Or you can produce anywhere along these points. And one of the things that economists ask to take into consideration is, what is the cost? So, for instance, if you do put all of your resources into producing wine, the cost is all of this cotton that you could have made otherwise. And the opposite is true. If you put everything into cotton, then the cost is all of this wine that you could produce. And anytime you move in between any of these points, you're giving up a little bit of one or the other. Now, note they also have these 2 points in and outside of the curve. At this point out here is beyond what resources you have, point Y. So you can't produce that much cotton or wine because it's virtually impossible. What is something that can improve in the future so you can get to that point is you either acquire more resources or technology so that you can produce out to that point. Producing inside the curve is what we call underutilization. It means that you're not using all your resources properly. So maybe you're protecting some of the land for environmental reasons, or maybe there's been a disaster, or maybe there aren't enough people to work. And so in any of those cases, you're underutilizing resources and therefore you're not producing as much. But economists use these types of models to simplify things. Now, obviously, is there a country who can only produce cotton or wine? No, that's ridiculous. So the reason why they do this is to simplify things as much as possible and provide a mathematical model in order to prove their points. And whenever they do, of course, do this, they're using the scientific process. So economics is a science and that science develops theories based on these models and they test it with evidence in order to prove them. So they're following the same process as a natural scientist in biology or chemistry or whatever would. Of course, there are errors. There are errors that happen because obviously whenever you use simplified models, you cast aside the fact that humans are incredibly complex and often irrational. And so those are things that critics use against economic theory. They say it's impossible for humans to be completely rational, and there are a lot of things we do that aren't necessarily going to fit into some box of, well, if you do this and you're going to give up this kind of cost, and people are going to take those in consideration. Some people are incredibly critical, though, of human beings, saying that they should follow economic models. They should make rational decisions at all times. So there is some kind of pushback against that. And then, of course, economists do provide theories based in two different ways. They either present information in a positive or normative manner. A positive manner is how the world is. What is it like? So an economist, an easy way to remember it, who is a positive theorist would say, I am positively certain this is the way the world is, because those are the facts. For instance, you can theorize that if the minimum wage is raised, will that cause unemployment to go up? And there is mathematical proof that yes, that is true. I mean, some businesses are going to lay off employees. That's all that's going to happen. That can happen even without the minimum wage. If you need to attract a certain type of employee to your business, so you raise your pay in order to get that employee to come to you, you're probably going to have to lay off some of your lower wage employees in order to make up the difference. So that happens with or without the minimum wage. And then there's normative economic theory. That is how the world should be. So an economist putting together information, well, this is the poverty in the United States, and this is how long it's been since wages have gone up. That's why we should raise minimum wage. So those are two different approaches to economic theory, how the world positively is or what the normal should be. And when we study economics, we can look at it through a macro or a micro perspective. And obviously, those two different prefixes mean bigger or smaller. But what we're talking about here when it comes to macroeconomics is the big picture. What do societies, what do nations do when it comes to economics? What kind of decisions do they make? And most of the theory involves either fiscal or monetary policy. Fiscal policy is the spending practices of the government. So Congress, state legislatures are in charge of fiscal policy. How much do they buy? Governments are often big customers. The United States federal government is the biggest customer in the world, buying more goods and services than anyone else. And it also involves monetary policy. What is a country doing with its money supply? What is happening with inflation and interest rates? In the United States, that is not determined by Congress. Does anybody know what organization determines the monetary policy of the United States? Yeah?
Is it the stock market?
Ooh, it has an influence, but ooh, you're close. The first word there is federal is the first word in FDIC. Food and Drug Administration? No. The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is our centralized banking system, and it is the one who helps determine monetary policy. So they decide the supply of money, which impacts its value, which impacts inflation. They also have control over interest rates, or at least the prime rate that everybody else bases their interest rates on. And so the Federal Reserve has that power involving the monetary policy. The reason how it's related to the government, though, is the chairman and its board are nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. And it was established by an act of Congress. Otherwise, though, it's mostly in the private sector through our nation's banks. So that's macroeconomics in a nutshell. And it includes all the problems that countries experience on a broader level: unemployment, poverty, things of that nature. And then there's microeconomics. That looks at, you can think of as smaller decisions, but those not on a societal level. What individuals and businesses do when it comes to choices, supply and demand, how those two interact in order to create prices. And then also how we categorize industries and how they interact in the marketplace. And we'll look at both of those in this part of the course, both macro and microeconomics. Models and theories is way down there at the bottom, even though I already talked about it. Apparently, I don't know why I put it way down there. It should have been up above PPF. But models and theories, once again, that's just how economists express not only their information, but also how they make determinations, because obviously the world and all the choices that people make are incredibly complicated. And so it's much easier to research and then explain that through simplified models. But once again, part of the problem of that is humans are more complicated than that. And the last thing up there is type of economy. Something else economists do is they look at the type of economies that countries have, how they make basic determinations, and they also try to categorize them. That again? The economists look at types of economies to determine exactly how they make their decisions, and then also they try to categorize those economies basically into the following ways. And there are four types of economies altogether that they categorize them in. The first one would be traditional economies. They're incredibly basic. All human beings started off with a traditional economy, bartering and trading. I will give you so many loaves of bread for that goat, that kind of thing. And chances are, if you were baking bread, so did your parents and their parents and their parents and their parents. So traditional economies see little change. But eventually, of course, we started to develop domesticated plants and animals more and more often than basic technology, starting with things like the Stone Age, then the Bronze Age, and so forth. And so we eventually developed more complex tools besides just things like hammers and spears. And we're able to utilize those in order to increase productivity. And so eventually, at a point in human history, humans started to be able to produce a surplus beyond what they needed in order to survive. And whenever a surplus is created, what do you do with the surplus? Well, you sell it. You want to make some type of gain for yourself because of that. And everybody specializes on something in particular, and some people are better than others. If you are really good at something, it means that you have an absolute advantage, that you can predict or you can produce one of the best products possible. So people started to concentrate in marketplaces. So eventually we developed a marketplace economy or market economy. Sometimes we also call it free market economy or capitalist economy. But in a free market economy, we then start to congregate and sell goods and services. And we did this all on our own. No one directed us to do this. No one told us you should grow more crops or raise more animals and then go and sell it. This is all done through individual choice. And a free market economy, especially when we put that word free on there, emphasizes that it is all done through individual decision-making by people and businesses. There is no law or government that forces people or interferes or involves themselves in the decision-making process. Eventually, of course, we got to the point where we industrialized, and when that happened, people aren't really involved in the decision-making process of the production as much because they've gone beyond their own farms and countryside. They move to cities, they work in factories, and they produce all of these goods and services through their labor, but it isn't necessarily something they're involved with in the decision-making process except to work there. And so that's when some people, like Karl Marx, started to develop their theories that maybe the people should come together in a sort of governing process in order to seize control of the decision-making. Whenever that happens, whenever we set up a socialist state, it is known as a command economy. So that's the third type of economy that can take place, a command economy. And so the government is making the economic decisions. Now, when Karl Marx wrote about this, his intention is it was the only way to equal the playing field to make sure that some weren't taking advantage of others, because he believed that process of taking advantage created all of the problems that occurred in the world: imperialism, slavery, warfare, and so on. So we usually place, speaking of models with two variables, we usually place free market at one end of the spectrum and command at the other end. But in truth, is there such a thing as a perfectly free economy? And the answer is no. Even in the freest economies in the world, there are at least some laws. No, you cannot go in business to kill other people. That is wrong. And so we pass laws against that. And so you placed a restriction on the economy. And then on the other end of the spectrum, is it possible for the government to control every single decision? And the answer is no. Even in North Korea, there is a large black market for Band-Aids and milk and other stuff like that. So people are going to go around the government in order to make their own decisions. The truth is, every economy technically is in the fourth one, which is a mixed economy. A mixed economy has some kind of combination of both free market and command. And so the question that every society needs to ask itself is, where does it want to be on that spectrum? The United States is closer toward the free market side of the spectrum, and so is most of Western Europe. Where you have North Korea is on the far end of the spectrum, on the other side toward command. Are we the freest economy in the world? The answer is no. And you'd be surprised, some of the countries that have government-run healthcare and higher taxes are actually freer than us because they have less regulation. Sweden, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, They have all those paid things, so you would think they would be less free, but actually they're often rated by more conservative groups as being freer because they have less regulation on their economy. So that gets kind of complicated about where exactly you are. But we are one of the countries more toward the free end. The freest economy in the world would totally shock people because it's not actually a country, it's a city-state, and its name is Hong Kong. Even though they have had some problems with their big brothers there in China and democracy over the last few years, their economy is incredibly free. They didn't even establish a minimum wage until about 6 or 7 years ago. Before, they didn't have any. And so there's a lot of freedom in their economic decision-making process. And China isn't interested in infringing on that because Hong Kong is a major financial hub that makes them a lot of money. So they don't want them to vote or speak out or protest, but they're fine with them selecting however they do business and own property and get jobs and so on. So those are just some types of economies, some of the ways we categorize economies. So if you haven't already, you can go ahead and submit that